The evening my husband allowed me to spend time with his nephew turned out to be one of the most thrilling nights of my life. It all took place a few weeks ago when the sun set low on the horizon, casting a gentle orange hue over the city skyline from our townhouse window. I watched as nightfall gradually took over, the hum of traffic below mixing with the distant sounds of conversations. Normally, this kind of peaceful ambiance would have calmed me, but tonight it left a stirring feeling within me. Robert, my husband, had left earlier that afternoon for a weekend work retreat. It wasn't the first time he had gone on a business trip, but today felt different. Perhaps it was the unusual request he made as he kissed me goodbye. "Evelyn," he said, lingering for a moment, "keep an eye on James while I'm gone. He's still adjusting, and I don't want him to feel like a guest. Make him feel at home." James, his 19-year-old nephew, had been staying with us for a couple of weeks after finishing high school and before starting college in the city. He had arrived with bags slung over his shoulders, looking both shy and grateful. Robert had insisted we take him in temporarily to help him settle in, and I didn't mind. James was respectful, polite, and had a quiet charm that made him easy to be around. Still, the house felt different without Robert. Though James and I maintained a cordial relationship, something felt subtly different tonight as the sky darkened and the house slipped into its usual evening stillness. At 7, I heard the familiar sound of footsteps on the stairs, and James appeared in the doorway of the living room. His dark hair was slightly tousled, and he wore a simple hoodie and jeans. He flashed me a small smile as he entered, looking younger than his age. "Hey, Aunt Evelyn." He greeted me, his voice soft and warm. "Robert told me you'd be here all weekend," I replied, putting my book aside. "He didn't want you to feel left out." James chuckled lightly as he sat down on the couch opposite me. "He worries too much. I'm fine." A comfortable silence followed. I noticed how relaxed he seemed, his long legs stretched out on the couch. He appeared more at ease than usual. "Are you hungry?" I asked after a moment. "Yeah," he admitted, sitting up slightly. "What's for dinner?" I motioned for him to follow me into the kitchen. "Let's figure it out." We settled on a simple meal of pasta with homemade sauce. James offered to help, and together we moved through the kitchen in a way that felt surprisingly natural. He skillfully chopped vegetables, his hands steady, while I stirred the pot on the stove. The atmosphere between us was light, filled with occasional jokes and anecdotes. "You're not bad at this," I said, glancing at him as he diced a tomato. He grinned. "Neither are you. I thought you'd burn water." "Rude," I replied, but I couldn't help laughing. When dinner was ready, we sat down at the table. The soft glow of the overhead light created a warm atmosphere. Conversation flowed easily as we talked about his college plans, his thoughts on the city, and a few funny stories about Robert from his childhood. James spoke with quiet confidence, and I found myself hanging on every word. After dinner, we moved back to the living room. James took his usual spot on the couch, stretching out as though the space belonged to him. I sat in my armchair, but my attention kept drifting toward him. He had an unusual confidence tonight, something that intrigued me. "Thanks for dinner," he said after a while, breaking the silence. "It was nice. You didn't have to go to all that trouble." "It's no trouble," I replied. "I enjoyed it." There was another pause, this one heavier. James's gaze met mine, and for a moment the room felt smaller. The air was thick with something unspoken, but palpable. "I think I'll head to bed soon," he murmured, though he didn't move to get up right away. "Yeah," I said softly, feeling my heart race. He lingered for a moment longer, his gaze lingering on me in a way that felt intentional. With a small smile, he stood and stretched. "Good night, Aunt Evelyn." "Good night, James." I watched as he climbed the stairs, the sound of his footsteps fading as he disappeared down the hallway. I sat there for a long time after, the weight of the moment pressing on me. Something had shifted tonight, though I couldn't quite explain what. All I knew was that I wasn't ready to let the evening end just yet. The house was quiet now, save for the faint ticking of the wall clock and the occasional creak of the wooden floors as the night settled in. I lingered in the living room for a while, fixated on the flickering glow from the fireplace. My thoughts kept returning to James. There was something in his demeanor that night, an energy I couldn't quite pinpoint, yet couldn't disregard either. Eventually, I made my way upstairs, my feet soft against the carpeted steps. The hallway was dim, only illuminated by the faint light from a nightlight near the guest room. James's door was slightly ajar, and as I passed, I hesitated. The sound of his steady breathing drifted to me. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. This was absurd. I continued toward my bedroom, closing the door behind me. Yet as I changed into my pajamas and climbed into bed, my mind wandered back to him. His effortless smile, the way his gaze lingered on mine just a beat too long. I turned over, staring at the ceiling, my chest tight with a mix of emotions I couldn't quite identify. Sleep wouldn't come. The stillness of the house felt suffocating, the silence deafening in my ears. I couldn't explain why, but after what seemed like hours, I found myself slipping out of bed. My feet moved soundlessly across the floor as I headed down the hallway, drawn by some unspoken pull. James's door was still ajar, the soft light from his bedside lamp spilling out into the corridor. I paused for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. "James?" I whispered softly. From inside, there was a rustle of movement, and then his voice, low and warm, answered, "Yeah." I gently pushed the door open and stepped inside. He was sitting up in bed, the blankets pulled around his waist. His dark hair was tousled, his eyes heavy with sleep but still alert. "Can't sleep?" I asked, standing awkwardly by the door. He gave a faint smile, tilting his head slightly. "Me neither." For a while, we simply stared at each other, the silence heavy between us. Then, almost hesitantly, James patted the empty space next to him on the bed. "Want to sit?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. I hesitated, every rational thought screaming that this was a bad idea, but there was something in his gaze, an openness, a quiet vulnerability that pulled me in. I crossed the room and perched on the edge of the bed, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "Is something on your mind?" he asked, his tone gentle but curious. I wasn't sure how to answer. "I don't know," I replied finally. "Just restless, I guess." He nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. "Me too." The air between us felt thick again, laden with unspoken words and unsaid emotions. I glanced at him, catching a glimpse of his sharp jawline, the curve of his lips. He looked different in the soft light, softer, more vulnerable. "I'm glad you're here," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. I turned toward him, my brow furrowing slightly. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, his gaze dropping to his hands. "I don't know. It's just nice having someone around, someone who gets it." "Gets what?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He met my eyes then, his gaze raw. "What it's like to feel alone, like no one really sees you?" His words hit me hard, the honesty like a punch to the gut. I swallowed, my throat tightening. "I see you," I said softly, the words slipping out before I could stop them. His eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, he reached out, his fingers brushing against mine. The touch was electric, sending a shiver down my spine. I looked at him, searching his face for any sign of what he might be thinking. "James," I began, my voice trembling, but he shook his head, cutting me off. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I need this, even if it's just for a moment." I didn't know how to respond. My mind was a whirlwind, emotions spinning too fast to make sense of. Then his fingers laced with mine, warm and steady, grounding me in the present. Without thinking, I leaned into him, the distance between us vanishing. His other hand came up to touch my face, the gesture gentle but firm, as if he feared I might slip away. Closing my eyes, I surrendered, the world around us fading as his lips met mine. It started tentative, a soft brush of skin against skin, then deepened, growing more urgent, each second igniting a heat that spread through my body. His hands found my waist, pulling me closer, and I let him. My hands instinctively moved to his shoulders, anchoring myself to this moment, to him. It was wrong, I knew that, yet in the stillness of the kiss, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. His lips were warm, insistent, and there was a weight to him, a closeness I hadn't realized I needed. I longed for this. For what felt like an eternity, my heart raced with each pulse, loud and frantic in the otherwise silent room. I murmured near his lips, uncertain of what I was trying to express. Was I telling him to stop or urging him to continue? I couldn't even tell, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he deepened the kiss, his hands gripping me tighter, sending another wave of chills down my back. My body responded naturally, moving closer, pressing into him in ways both unfamiliar and deliciously right. He pulled away from the kiss, resting his forehead against mine as we both tried to catch our breath. His dark, intense eyes scanned mine, attempting to decipher thoughts I wasn't ready to reveal. "Are you okay?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I nodded, though my mind was spinning. "Yeah," I whispered, feeling small and uncertain. Relief softened his expression, and he smiled slightly, his thumb brushing gently against my cheek. "Good," he murmured. For a moment, we sat in silence. It wasn't awkward, though it felt thick with something unspoken, but mutual. I could feel his heartbeat against mine, steady and grounding, calming me in a way I hadn't expected. But as the fog of the kiss started to fade, reality crept back, heavy, pressing down on my chest. "This is crazy," I finally said, my voice shaking. James chuckled softly, his breath warm on my skin. "Yeah," he admitted, his tone light yet serious. "But it doesn't feel wrong, does it?" I hesitated. The question lingered in the air between us. Did it feel wrong? My rational mind screamed that it did, that we shouldn't have crossed this line, but my heart, my treacherous, aching heart, told a different tale. "No," I confessed, the words slipping out before I could stop it. "It doesn't." His smile widened slightly, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "Maybe it's not," he said softly, his hand still holding my face. I wanted to believe him, to trust that this moment was something pure, something right, but fear and doubt still clung to the edges of my thoughts, pulling me back to reality. "What if?" I began, but the words caught in my throat. "What if this changes everything?" James shook his head, his gaze steady and unwavering. "It doesn't have to," he said firmly. "We can take it one step at a time. No pressure, no expectations, just this." He leaned in again, his lips brushing mine softly, and I felt the tension in my chest slowly dissipate. His hands moved to my back, pulling me closer, and I allowed him to, my own hands tangling in his hair as the kiss deepened once more. His touch was gentle yet insistent, each movement thoughtful and unhurried. It felt as though he was savoring every moment, every sensation. I allowed myself to fall completely into him. For the first time in what felt like forever, I let myself simply be, to be present in the moment. The world outside blurred and faded, leaving only us, lost in the quiet intimacy of the night. When we finally pulled apart, our breathing was heavy, our bodies still pressed together. I looked at him, my heart full and heavy at once. "This is going to make things complicated, isn't it?" I whispered, a small smile tugging at my lips despite the gravity of my words. James grinned, his eyes sparkling with a mix of affection and mischief. "Probably," he admitted, "but I think it's worth it." I nodded, my chest tight with emotions I couldn't name. "Yeah," I whispered, "me too." James rested his head on my shoulder, his breath warm against my neck. The room was silent, except for the soft hum of the night. I wrapped an arm around him, pulling him closer, and he sighed contentedly. The quiet between us was filled with unspoken thoughts, a shared understanding words couldn't capture. After a while, James shifted slightly, lifting his head to look at me. "I don't want this to be a one-time thing," he said quietly, his voice firm, but laced with a vulnerability that made my chest ache. I hesitated, tracing absent patterns on his back. "Neither do I admitted softly, "but I don't know how we make this work." His eyes met mine, filled with determination. "We'll figure it out," he said confidently. "We don't have to have all the answers now, one day at a time." His words were reassuring, though the weight of the situation remained. The thought of letting this go, of letting him go, seemed unbearable. "Okay," I whispered finally, my voice barely audible. "One day at a time." He smiled, pressing a soft kiss to my forehead. "That's all we need," he said, his words a quiet promise. We stayed like that, wrapped in each other, the rest of the world forgotten. It felt safe, comforting, as if we had found something we hadn't even known we were searching for. And for now, that was enough. His touch was intoxicating, and each time I thought it was the last, he was ready for another round. Eventually. I believe we finished after 5 or 6 tries. When we were done, James's hands gently slid up my arms, his touch sending a rush of shivers down my spine. "I've wanted this for so long," he murmured softly against my lips, his voice thick with emotion. "I just didn't know if you felt the same." "I didn't realize it either," I confessed, my forehead resting against his. "But now that I do, I don't want to stop." He smiled tenderly, his thumb lightly grazing my cheek. Then we won't, he whispered. The hours passed as we navigated this new territory together, each moment growing more intense and intimate than the one before. There was no hesitation, no fear, just a mutual understanding that this was where we were meant to be. By the time the fire had reduced to embers, we were wrapped in each other's arms, breathing in harmony. James's head rested on my chest as I ran my fingers through his hair, marveling at how perfect it all felt. "This changes everything," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead. "It does," I agreed. "But it's a change I'm ready for. We'll figure it out together, one step at a time." James smiled, his eyes meeting mine with a warmth that made my heart ache. "I trust you," he said simply. "And I trust you," I replied, my voice firm and filled with conviction. As the night stretched on, we stayed there on the couch, unwilling to let go of the moment. Whatever challenges lay ahead, we knew we would face them together, bound by a love that had finally been set free. The next morning, I awoke to the faint sounds of birds outside the window and the soft creak of footsteps in the hallway. For a moment, I wasn't sure if the events of the night before had been real or just a vivid dream. But the warmth lingering in my chest told me it was real. Every glance, every whispered word, every shared touch. I took a deep breath, got out of bed, and put on a sweater as I made my way to the kitchen. James was already there, standing by the counter with a cup of coffee in his hands. His hair was slightly tousled, and he wore an oversized hoodie that made him look younger, more vulnerable. When he saw me enter, his face broke into a shy smile. "Morning," he said, his voice soft but warm. "Morning," I replied, my voice still thick with sleep. I moved to pour myself a cup of coffee, the silence between us comfortable, yet filled with a quiet energy. The weight of what we had shared hung in the air, unspoken but ever present. James leaned against the counter, his gaze fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. I nodded, meeting his eyes. "Yeah, I'm okay." "And you?" He hesitated before nodding slowly. "Yeah," he said, though there was a slight tremor in his voice. "It's just, I can't stop thinking about last night." I set my coffee down and stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. "Me neither," I admitted, "but it's a lot to process. We need to take this slow, figure out what it means for us." James nodded, his expression softening. "I don't want to rush anything," he said. I just, I don't want to lose this. Lose you." "You won't," I said firmly, squeezing his arm. "We'll figure it out together." He smiled, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "Thank you," he said softly. We spent the rest of the morning in quiet companionship, exchanging small smiles and touches as we went about our day. There was an unspoken agreement between us, a mutual understanding to take things one step at a time. As the day went on, I found myself watching James more closely, his movements, his smiles, the way his eyes lit up when he laughed. It was like seeing him in a new light, and it filled me with a warmth I hadn't felt in years. By the time evening came, we found ourselves on the couch again, the soft glow of the fireplace casting flickering shadows on the walls. James sat close to me, his shoulder brushing against mine, and I felt a quiet sense of contentment settle over me. "Do you think this is crazy?" he asked suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. I turned to look at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his tone. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, his gaze fixed on the fire. "Us? This? It's not exactly normal." I reached out, taking his hand in mine. "Maybe it's not normal," I said, "but it feels right, and that's what matters." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of hope and uncertainty. "You really think so?" "I do," I said, my voice steady. "As long as we're honest with each other, as long as we're careful, we can figure this out together." "Together," he repeated, his smile small but genuine as he squeezed my hand tightly. "Thank you," he said softly, "for not running away, for giving this a chance." "I couldn't run away, even if I wanted to," I teased, a smile tugging at my lips. "You're kind of hard to escape." He laughed, the sound light and genuine, and it filled me with a quiet joy. In that moment, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. As the night wore on, we stayed side by side, the warmth of the fire and the comfort of each other's presence wrapping around us like a blanket. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was ours. And I think that was enough. I'm not sure if it's okay what I did, And I haven't told Robert anything yet. Should I tell him? I don't know. I just don't know.